Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest of the Edinburgh Lectures. It's really good to see so many of you here this evening. Fantastic to have virtually a full house here. And I think you have shown excellent judgment because we have a bit of a treat for you tonight. My name's April McMahon and I'm Vice Principal here for Planning, Resources and Research Policy. So welcome to the University of Edinburgh. Welcome to the Playfair Library Hall. If you're going to have a lecture that draws upon ideas about the Enlightenment and about the city, then this is just about as good a place to have such a lecture as any. And as many of you will know, it shows a particular architectural style of bringing the external architecture that's been conventional in cityscapes indoors. And I think that gives us quite a nice setting, therefore, for this evening's lecture. The Edinburgh Lectures have been going on in the city since 1992. Many of you may know that they were part of a programme of events that celebrated the UK's presidency of the European Union. And it ended up in 1992 in December with a European summit that was held here in Edinburgh. And the idea was that a series of lectures would form around those events. But they were such a success that we've continued them in the city every year since. Each series has a range of major public issues being addressed. And this year it's Talking Cities. So the idea is to explore how the idea of the city and interpretations of the city can actually provide solutions to our cultural and social and environmental challenges today. And we've had over 200 very high caliber speakers in the series, so no pressure for this evening's speaker, but we've already heard from Stephen Hawking, from Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal, from Mikhail Gorbachev, Jackie Stewart and John Simpson, and you can work out where tonight's lecturer, Nick Phillipson, fits in with that typology later. The lectures are led by the City of Edinburgh Council, and we're very grateful to them and to all of the other partners who play a part in hosting this series. The partnership also involves this university, the University of Edinburgh, Heriot Watt University, Edinburgh Napier, the Open University in Scotland, the National Museums of Scotland, Creative Scotland, the Scottish Government, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and Queen Margaret University. So it's a real city partnership that takes place over the series every year. To turn to tonight's lecture and to tonight's lecturer, Nicholas Phillipson lectured in history at Edinburgh for some considerable time before retiring from full-time employment in 2004. And I stress the full-time employment because in excellent academic tradition, he has been busier and more in demand since he retired than he ever was before. He is an Honorary Research Fellow here at the university, and he's held visiting appointments at Princeton, Yale, Tulsa, the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., and the Ludwigs-Maximilian Universitat in Munich. His research interests focus on the cultural and intellectual history of early modern and modern Scotland, and there's a particular interest in the history of the Scottish Enlightenment. He's been co-director of a Leverhulme-funded project on the science of man in Scotland and is an associate editor of the New Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, as well as being an editor of the journal Modern Intellectual History. He's recently completed an intellectual biography of Adam Smith, and he tells me that he has been in America promoting that book for the last month, an activity he described to me earlier as being like a vulgar travelling salesman. I'm sure that wasn't exactly right. So tonight's lecture is going to look at Edinburgh then and now, and whether indeed we are dealing with a modern Athens. So I ask you to join me, please, in welcoming Nicholas Phillipson, tonight's lecturer.
Thank you very much, Vice Principal, and thank you very much for coming, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to give a lecture in this particular series. The relationship between the university and the city is something that's I've spent some time on in the past and it interests me greatly. And it also gives me the chance to reflect perhaps on the relationship between the city, the university, and one of its greatest, not alumni, but associates, David Hume, who, although never a graduate, studied at this university, and whose 350th anniversary we celebrate this year. Now, my starting point, and the thing that interests me, and has interested me for a long time, is the title that Edinburgh is always given as the Athens of the North, Athenian Edinburgh. And the meaning of this and what we can infer from it about the nature of enlightened culture in Edinburgh. Now, in 1707, at the time of the Union, it was clear, one of the few things that was really clear, that whatever happened at the time of the Union would have enormous consequences for the city of Edinburgh. A union with England would inevitably mean the abolition of the Scots Parliament and probably the Scots Privy Council. It would mean the exodus of the great territorial nobility upon whom power broking depended in Scotland along the high road to London. It would mean a loss of power, a loss of prestige, a loss of revenue from a high spending nobility. It would mean, as Robert Chambers was going to put it in the 19th century, that Edinburgh would become a widowed metropolis. And it's at this time that I have begun to find stray references to what is to happen to Edinburgh in the future. And those stray references including the notion that perhaps a post-Union Edinburgh might become a modern Athens. Now, as far as my own reading is concerned, what that meant or was thought to mean at the time is far from clear. It crops up in 3 or 4 places as an idea without any particular definition. And it's not going to be until the late 1750s, the early 1760s, that the notion of Edinburgh, post-Union Edinburgh, as a modern Athens starts to take shape. And it does so in radically changed circumstances. By the 1750s, Edinburgh has, rather surprisingly in some people's eyes, still retained its function as a centre of government, a centre of administration. It was a convenient place for the government to do ordinary political business with its constituents, its county constituents, and goodness knows there are few enough of them, and its ordinary patronage business, its ordinary administrative business. But it was a city with a much changed elite. In place of an elite dominated by the nobility, the great titled territorial nobility, the city was possessed of an elite composed of the professions and the landed gentry, particularly of the Lothians and the border regions, people who came to Edinburgh for the winter months. It was, to use 18th century parlance, an elite composed of the middling ranks of Scottish society, of lowland Scottish society. Not the middle class, but the middling ranks, the professions including the landed gentry. And it was a civic elite which had, by the 1750s, started to develop its own distinctive civic culture. Among the clergy, and particularly the moderate Presbyterian clergy, among the legal community, and particularly in the faculty of advocates, there is a preoccupation about the role of the church, the role of the legal profession in the public life of a post-Union Scotland. What was the and the beginnings of a notion that perhaps the law, either the law or the church, in some way embodied the spirit of a pre-Union Scotland. Perhaps lawyers and the clergy had some claim to be regarded as the watchdogs of Scottish liberties. It was a city in which landowners were preoccupied with agricultural improvement and the commercial management of their estates. And more generally, it was an elite which was preoccupied with what we might call modernization and what in the 18th century people called improvement, with the improvement of the political, of the economic, of the cultural resources of the country in a post-Union world. And added to this was the notion that that under these circumstances, the city demanded a new set of public buildings, a new housing stock fit for a post-Union polite age. And in collective terms, this elite had started to get a rather informal corporate existence, a corporate existence which was embodied in that network of clubs and societies, or the upper reach of those clubs and societies with which the city's social and cultural life has been so famously associated in the 18th century. Some of these clubs were orientated to one or another section of the community. The Belles Lettres Society of 1759 was a club much beloved of the moderate clergy. The Speculative Society, 1764, of the younger members of the Faculty of Advocates. But added to this, the Philosophical Society, shortly to become, or in a generation to become, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the focal point of the natural and medical science community, and again, the Select Society of 1754 and onwards of the society dedicated to the pursuit of the philosophy, the arts and letters. But the thing that interests me here for the purposes of this discussion is what this sort of informal corporate organization added up to. It was the organization, it was the institutional expression of an elite derived from the professions, associating itself with the public management, with the management of public life in Scotland, with the improvement of Scottish civil society, but one whose primary function was to relate the discussion of things which were of particular importance to their own professions, to their own form of philosophy or science, to questions of the public interest and particularly of governance, to the question of how in fact improvement was to be effected, whether it was to be effected by the action of public-minded advocates or moderate clergy, whether it was the business of government in any sort of way. This preoccupation with governance, associated with the arts and sciences, associated with the professions, associated with post-Union Edinburgh, is very characteristic of this culture of the 1750s and early 1760s. And it matters to historians of the Scottish Enlightenment because it's from this elite that the texts which were to make Edinburgh and through Edinburgh, Scotland, of particular significance to the world outside. It is within the bosom of this elite that we see, to the bosom of this elite, I should say, that David Hume, Adam Smith, Robertson, Adam Ferguson, William Cullen, Joseph Black, and of course Ossian belong. It's within this framework that these texts are generated. And it's these texts which are going to be historically important because it is these that are going to give Edinburgh its first international recognition. As Voltaire put it in 1763 at his most sarcastic, it is a wonderful result of the progress of human culture that at this day there comes to us from Scotland rules of taste and all the arts, from epic poetry to gardening. Every day the mind of man expands, and we ought not to despair of receiving ere long treatises on poetry and rhetoric from the Orkney Isles. This then is the period in which not only a distinctive civil society takes shape with a distinctive culture, but it also starts to produce an intellectual culture which is internationally recognized. And it's at this point that contemporaries started to ask questions about where this culture had come from. How was one to explain this progress in the arts and sciences that was apparently appearing without warning? And if you scan the Edinburgh Press, if you scan the magazines, the pamphlet literature, what comes through is a fairly agreed story about why Scotland was acquiring this sort of status in the arts and sciences. The assumption was that the root cause of the progress in the arts and sciences was to be found in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and in the Union. Not just the Union, but the Glorious Revolution as well as the Union. The reason for that was that the Glorious Revolution had brought about one form of constitutional change. It had limited the power of the monarch. And at the same time, as a consequence, the Presbyterian Church had been restored. The Union had, and this is something that's not, I think, often enough appreciated about the Union, had performed the vital function of curbing the power of the territorial nobility. One of the, in fact, I'll just go off my script for a moment. One of the things that I think is not often enough realized as a characteristic of the thinking of the Scottish literati at the time of the Enlightenment was just how deep the distrust of the great territorial nobility was. There are very few people, with the exception of, I mean, there are obvious exceptions, and John Dalrymple's one of them, but the belief that the way in which the territorial nobility had managed their estates, had rack-rented their estates, had disastrous consequences for the Scottish landed economy in the late 17th century and for public liberties in the late 17th century. No one has a good word to say for them, and in fact, one of the minor themes in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is that, in fact, one of the problems any modern government has to face is not just simply grasping merchants or manufacturers, it's the great landed nobility, who, after all, employ most of the people of any Western country. But anyway, as I say, one of the reasons the Union was thought to be a good thing was because it had drawn the titled nobility out of the political arena in Scotland and transferred them to a much, much bigger arena at Westminster, and as such had started to control what was taken to be the destructive role they had played in maintaining the Scottish state before the Union. But anyway, to return to my text, the argument was that, in fact, the roots of Scotland's recent progress in the arts and the sciences could be attributed to these fundamental constitutional changes which have been brought about by the Glorious Revolution and by the Union and by the free trade that the Union had brought with it. And the explanation was that the consequences of political stability had been to generate economic activity and cultural activity. And as I say, it is interesting to see that progress in the arts and sciences was being given a political, an essentially political cause. The cause was a correction in the awful shortcomings of the Scottish Constitution brought about by the changes associated with the Revolution and the Union. But anyway, it was in this context that the notion that Edinburgh might be emerging as or might be properly described as a modern Athens starts to appear. Listen to Sir Alexander Dick in 1762. He is writing to a friend about a proposal to set up an academy of riding, of horsemanship in Edinburgh. And it was this that drove him to think of Edinburgh not just simply as a modern Athens, but as the Athens of Britain. He says, where in this Athens of Britain, where instead of the awkward and monkish pedantry of old-fashioned universities, young gentlemen will be initiated in the principles of useful knowledge and at the same time exercised in these liberal accomplishments which qualify a man to appear in the distinguished species of life. This is very interesting because here Dick is suggesting that in fact Edinburgh is becoming an educational centre in which the values of the city spill over into the academic values of the university, in which there's an interplay between the culture of town and gown, and an interplay which is favourable to the education, the education of a British elite. Now, it was an enticing and actually rather disturbing image that Dick was conjuring up. As every schoolboy knew in the 18th century, it had been the fate of Athens to fall under the rule of imperial Rome. It had been conquered by Rome. Historically, what had happened to Athens is Athens had become the source of the culture on which imperial Rome had drawn. Imperial Rome, so it was thought, having been unable to develop that culture itself. And so, in one respect, it was flattering. It's a very flattering image, this notion of Edinburgh as a modern Athens. On the other hand, it is associated with political failure, even political conquest at the same time. But on the other hand, it also, it begins, it doesn't completely, but it begins to give a foretaste of the role, in fact, of which this university and, in fact, the other Scottish universities were to serve. And, in fact, the literature of the Scottish Enlightenment was to serve the empire, the growing and burgeoning British Empire. For Rome, read Britain. For imperial Rome, read the British Empire. And I think it's not altogether surprising that this notion of Edinburgh as a British Athens doesn't actually last. Very shortly afterwards, it's going to be displaced by something much more woolly, something much more romantic. The notion that Edinburgh was the city was the Athens of the North. It's a description which I suspect follows on necessarily from the astonishing popularity that the poems of Ossian were to receive right the way through Europe in this, at this time. Now, the thing is that it's impossible not to stop and pause at this moment and say, how much does all of this say And how much does this image convey, and how much does the thinking behind the image convey of what made Edinburgh a centre of enlightenment, of international importance? All that's been done so far is to produce an image which has suggested how Edinburgh came to terms with the Union, and to suggest some reasons for which there could be relative progress in a more stable political environment in the arts and sciences as well as in the economy. Relative improvement is what the people have got to. And there's something missing. And I think that something missing is very well picked up by David Hume, who in 1757 characteristically raised the question without attempting to answer it. Really, it is admirable how many men of genius this country produces at present. Is it not strange that at a time when we have lost our princes, our parliament, our independent government, even the presence of our chief nobility, are unhappy in our accent of pronunciation, speak a very corrupt dialect of the tongue which we make use of? Is it not strange, I say, that in these circumstances we should really be the people the most distinguished for literature in Europe? That something else is needed to this revolution, union-based explanation of why there was a Scottish Enlightenment, why Edinburgh should have become a modern Athens. And Hume was the right person to ask the question in these terms. Hume was an extremely well-travelled man. He had written his first book, the Treatise on Human Nature, in France. He had spent time in the 40s, in France, in Italy, in Germany. He was going to spend more time in France later on in the 60s. He was even going to threaten to settle in France. And the point about this is that as a well-travelled, extremely well-informed person, Hume knew perfectly well that Europe, there were several cities in Europe which were not unlike Edinburgh. Toulouse, Bordeaux, Naples, nearer home, Dublin, or even, although he never went to America, Philadelphia. Great regional capital cities, which were centres of government, centres of administration, which had elites recruited like Edinburgh's from the professions, from the local landed classes. Great cities which were centres of commerce, which were centres of learning and centres of literature, with clubs, societies, academies, often universities. These were a common phenomenon in the Europe of the later Enlightenment. Edinburgh was not alone. And so the question becomes, why should Edinburgh, of all of these great regional capitals, and they're relatively new in formation, it's a European phenomenon, this growth of these great regional capitals. Why Edinburgh? The question becomes sharper. And what I want to do in this lecture is to suggest one of the reasons for which Edinburgh did actually suddenly erupt into a quite extraordinarily prolific source of learning and letters and science, which is of European and global significance. And the answer is in one word, and it is David Hume. David Hume, who is normally celebrated for his contributions to philosophy, which are enduring and will endure, but David Hume, who is not often enough considered as someone for whom Edinburgh remained the focal point of his life, as a philosopher for much longer than we think. There's much more stock to be taken of Hume's presence in Edinburgh and Hume's impact on the management and the production of Scottish intellectual life. And it's this I want to give just some inkling of here. And I do so because I want to suggest in all of this that the appearance of Hume and of a philosopher with Hume's interests and Hume's willingness to propagate these interests in Scotland, this comes over to me as a historical accident that no one could have predicted. In other words, if Edinburgh has a great deal in common with a lot of great cities, of great European cities, in terms of its political, economic, cultural organization and management, what none of these cities were actually possessed or were lucky enough to receive was the match that would light the touch paper of regional culture and allow it to erupt in the way that of central Scotland and Edinburgh does. Now, at one level, Hume belongs very much to the story I'm telling. He comes from the middling ranks of Scottish society. His family are borders gentry. They're Presbyterian. They have roots in local government, roots in the law. David Hume himself is educated as a lawyer. He gives it up because, like so many people who take up law, he found it extremely boring and preferred a life of philosophy and letters. But if all of these things make him part of this story, what sets him apart is, of course, his radical philosophical skepticism. And it's this skepticism that it seems to me really not to have been expected in the intellectual history of Scotland. It's a skepticism which is set out, as far as the public is concerned, in the Treatise of Human Nature of 1739-40, which very few read, but those who did remembered, and more generally in the essays and inquiries that he wrote in the course of the following decade. What was disturbing about Hume's religious skepticism in the context I'm talking about was his demonstration that the theological assumptions on which a Christian view of human nature, of ourselves and our duties, a Christian view of human understanding, as Hume was to call it, were these theological assumptions were philosophically trivial and also politically dangerous. Dangerous in the sense that history had shown that they generated superstition and enthusiasm, to use the contemporary terms. Dangerous in the sense that this superstition and enthusiasm had in fact detonated the terrible, terrible sectarian wars that had followed, that had plagued Europe in the century after the Reformation. And anyone who wishes to understand the Enlightenment in Scotland or elsewhere needs to remember the tribal effects of those wars of religion, those dreadful wars, those dreadful sectarian wars of the late 16th, early 17th century, delayed, as some thought, but only for a time in England and in Scotland, before erupting at the time of the Civil War in the Three Kingdoms. These are things that no enlightened thinker ever forgot about. These were events, these were terrible events, which so much philosophical and political thinking in the Enlightenment was designed to ensure that was to examine and, in fact, in many ways, to understand and perhaps to cure. Now, Hume's alternative account of the principles of human nature were, in their own ways, equally disturbing, because Hume claimed to demonstrate that a properly empirical account of the principles of human nature could only be derived from a study of human behavior as it appeared, he said, in common life. And as it appeared in common life, particularly by means of the sort of discourse that the language which people used in discussing their own affairs, the affairs of others, and the affairs of the country to which they belonged. It was a portrait, and what he developed, and he claimed that this would form the basis of a science of man, was an account of the principles of human understanding, which showed that actually the understanding that we have, if we strip out any theological assumptions, is going to be, it will always be derived from the imagination and the passions. It will always be shaped by the habits and customs of the world in which we live. In that sense, knowledge vanishes. All we can hope to have, Hume said, was understanding. The shift of the notion of our knowledge of the world from knowledge to understanding is actually, in many respects, contains the essence of Hume. And what was interesting was that in doing this, Hume again signalled a really quite extraordinary new approach to the relationship between philosophy and history. For how was one to study human beliefs? How was one to make sense of them and try and provide as complete an account of their origins? It was, in fact, by turning to history. If you wish to study the mind of an individual, you're involved in a quasi-biographical exercise in studying where those beliefs came from, the history of the beliefs that we hold at present. But studying those meant studying the context in which they had been raised. It meant studying, in fact, the institutions and the culture of the civil society which are given, in which the person had been born and raised. And studying that meant going a stage further back still, to studying the history of civil society in the context of the wider context of the civilization to which it was part. If we wished that the only certain knowledge, or the nearest we could get to a thick understanding of the principles of human nature, demanded historical talents, it directed citizens to saying, if you wish to study the principles of human nature, ultimately you are going to have to study history. Now, the point I want to make here, and the point that matters here, is that Hume's thinking penetrates the culture of Edinburgh and of Scotland much more profoundly than I think historians have been prepared to admit. Some read, not many people read Hume's treatise, more read his essays and inquiries. But I think the other thing we need to remember is that Hume, and again we're in the realm of historical accident, Hume actually was a very nice man. Hume was a man that people liked, and we can understand, if we read anything of his biography, why they did so. He might have been a bastard, I mean, say he'd been a recluse. Say he would have been a bad-tempered old skeptic, and that was actually the caricature of the skeptic in Europe at the time, was that they were cranky, they were bad-tempered, they were unsociable. Hume was none of these things. He could have been. He was none of these things. Hume also chose to spend his life in Edinburgh, in spite of the time he had to spend on tour as a diplomat, as a traveller to France. And again, in spite of his irritation with many of the aspects of Edinburgh life, but nevertheless he chose, in fact, to base himself in Edinburgh for most of his life. And as such, he communicated with Edinburgh. Not only was he sociable, but he makes a point of going out and talking round the clubs and societies of Edinburgh. No society can have had a better opportunity of understanding the Humean agenda than Edinburgh Society. What is more, this is not an end of the story, because it was Hume's good fortune to have as one of his first disciple a genius in the person of Adam Smith. And one of the most important themes, and it's one I've been working on for some time now, is the way in which Adam Smith develops and deepens all sorts of parts of the Humean agenda. He starts off by doing this in Edinburgh in the later 1740s. He then goes to Glasgow and develops an extraordinary moral philosophy curriculum, which is in fact essentially based on Humean principles, and therefore on principles which do not rely at all on theological premises. Now that is extraordinary. Glasgow, of all places, is the one university in the Western world which has developed a moral philosophy curriculum which does not depend at any level on religious assumptions about human nature and about the nature of human duty. There is no other university. And if you think that the moral philosophy class, particularly in Northern Europe, right the way through Northern Europe and throughout Scotland, is a curriculum which is designed to prepare boys for public life in the professions and in politics, not to mention the church. That is an extraordinary phenomenon. It's absolutely extraordinary phenomenon. And the point I want to make, and at the same time, what Smith does is that he develops the historical implications of this Humean revolution, and he does it in extraordinary ways, which it would not be, which I haven't time, and it would not be proper to this discussion to discuss here. But the point I want to make is that from 1740 right the way through to 1790, this highly developed, deeply skeptical, non-Christian, a-Christian, if perhaps you should say, in the hands of Adam Smith, is being parcelled out in central Scotland, and in fact in the Scottish universities, and in Edinburgh. It is a revolution of which no one can fail to be aware. And what I would in a different lecture want to show you is the effects of this on shaping the culture, the intellectual culture of Edinburgh. It's fascinating how often philosophical debate, historical discussion comes down to trying to reassess these principles in the light of the problem of whether it is possible to answer, to reply in any way to the non-religious agenda that is built in to this. It is Hume and Smith together with a single program who in fact galvanize this extraordinary regional culture and turn it into something which is going to be enormously important. So the point I want to make at this stage is that if we're to understand Enlightenment, we don't need just to understand the political, the economic, the cultural factors that go to shaping an enlightened environment. That won't get you an enlightenment. And I make this point because it may take your mind back to the 1990s, to the debate about devolution, when in fact the notion that Edinburgh might have a new enlightenment sometime after devolution resurfaced. There was an awful lot of crass thinking, it seems to me, going around in the devolution debate, which worked on the assumption that if you could correct one or two imbalances in the Scottish and British constitution by devolving a Scottish parliament, you would somehow release civic energies which would have, which would galvanise the economy, and in fact, so we were promised. No, we weren't promised. It was suggested. Would in fact give us reason to hope for a new Enlightenment. Now, I don't buy that, Walter, because it does not take into account the level of accident and circumstance which is necessary for Enlightenment. Could we have an Enlightenment on a Humean basis? Well, the chances, no doubt it is quite possible, that some extraordinary philosophico-scientific genius may in fact still be waiting to astonish us in Scotland. Whether or not they would stay in Scotland is another thing. The nearest you can get to that in my day, my long days in Edinburgh University, was in the mid-70s, when there really were extraordinary things happening in the field of artificial intelligence in this university. There was a group, an enormously fertile group was assembled by Principal Swan at that stage, but he couldn't keep it together. And the problems of keeping it together now, even if you could put a group like that together, would be insuperable. So it seems to me that if you want to say, could we have another Hume? You might, but I bet you wouldn't be able to keep him in Edinburgh, let alone in Scotland. On the other hand, I do think, and I do want to say in conclusion, that there is a sense in which I suspect we've had an enlightenment of a sort, and we haven't actually realised what it is. And that enlightenment is in the performing arts and in the Edinburgh Festival and the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. It seems to me that they have performed, and they did in the early decades, perform the function of reformatting the way in which the performing arts were practiced in this country and in fact overseas, and it was endlessly imitated. People don't quite realise just how much of a template the Edinburgh Festival has turned out to be in the modelling of festivals throughout Europe and America, and also how important the notion of festivals has been in people's reception of the performing arts. The notion that perhaps one of the best ways of learning from the performing arts is via short, sharp shocks rather than spread out seasons. That's an invention of the Edinburgh Festival and indeed the Fringe. And they've also, at their best, the Festival and the Fringe have had the capacity to disturb in this country and in this city people's understanding of what the performing arts should be about, in the same way that David Hume's philosophy deeply disturbed the Christian principles on which the public and academic culture of Scotland and indeed of the Western world depended. And again, these festivals have had the capacity, as had Hume, to make us uneasy. The problem is, where do they go from now? Have they lost that cutting edge, that ability to disturb? Because after all, enlightenments do come to an end. Hume's came to an end. It may be that this performing arts enlightenment that we have enjoyed for the last generation, it may be that its time is coming as well. Thank you very much.
Of course, we must remember that Scotland, for centuries before the 18th, had a very close cultural and intellectual association with many countries in Europe. And in the reign of James IV, we had 3 of the greatest poets in Europe. So Scotland was a very flourishing place, intellectually and culturally, long before the Union. And in fact, Alexander Brodie's recent history of Scottish philosophy demonstrated the importance of Scotland played in the evolution of philosophy over the whole of Europe for centuries. So to attribute the Enlightenment to the Union is a piece of absurdity. It's a negative fact. I mean, after all, Hume's letters are full of letters which he says, London is barbarian, saying, I can't bear to live there. It's full of barbarians and there are no literature to speak of and so on. So the Union was a threat. Perhaps it was to Scottish culture, and perhaps for that reason, in a sense, helped to rally it, in that people said, well, my God, we've got to resist this, which they did.
Well, the notion that the Union was a threat to Scottish culture, well, yes, but it was Hume that was the threat to Scottish culture. And the reason that Hume is the threat to Scottish culture is because Scottish culture before, as English, as French, as in fact Italian, was deeply Christian. One of the great objectives of the Enlightenment everywhere, and it's one of the, the epic stories in the history of European culture, was how, in fact, European philosophical culture was weaned off theology. It's one of the classic things. Weaned off dependence on revealed religion, dependence on natural religion. And in fact, what is interesting is that in Scotland, as elsewhere, the first part of that weaning had taken place, or took place basically during the Restoration period. The university records suggest that, by and large, people are still arguing philosophically on natural theological principles, essentially. But it's Hume and Smith between them who show up, who open the possibility of moving to a stage in which there is a dependence on a non-Christian philosophy and a non-Christian moral philosophy can be developed. And as I say, that is, it's not the Union that undermines Scottish philosophical culture. And as I say, I think no one, and what I'm anxious to do in this talk, and in fact in the work I'm engaged in at the moment, is to open up the case for Hume's influence outside the field of pure philosophy, into the field of a much wider public culture in Scotland. And as I say, I think what one might say is that historically, it's one of these fascinating one-generation phenomena. Hume and Smith, between them, open up the possibility of a science of man and an ethical culture dependent on it, on which all university education depends, which is a-Christian. However, the legacy doesn't last. That's the interesting thing. With the death of Hume, the death of Smith, other things start to happen, and the story becomes the story of how the philosophical reaction to Hume and Smith's agenda starts to take over the universities and underpin the public culture of Scotland in subsequent generations.
Yeah, I very much like the idea of Hume having this absolutely magnificent effect in his lifetime, but I'm slightly sceptical. I mean, when Hume came up to Edinburgh, Kames was already here, being quite influential. Over in Glasgow, there was Francis Hutcheson. And you've remarked how the wars of religion gave a disgust to the idea of founding or taking too seriously, shall we say, the pontifications of various religious creeds. So there was already plenty of motivation, and Hutcheson can be seen as a clear example, to build moral theory on the way people are. That's entirely compatible with seeing human nature as God-given. So Francis Hutcheson goes for a sentimentalist theory of morality, building morality on natural human sympathy, not that dissimilar to Hume's theory, but without any of the irreligious undercurrents. And you said that in Edinburgh people generally had a good opportunity to understand Hume's agenda. I think the irreligious agenda was pretty much hidden. People suspected it, but it didn't really have a major influence till sometime after Hume's life, I suggest.
Francis Hutcheson is still a moral theologian. It's that final break that matters. It's the same with Kames. And it's that, and if we're talking philosophy, the philosophical consequences of that move from a philosophy which is essentially a moral, which is based on natural theological principles in the last resort, and the reorganizing of thought that is that move that Hume takes. That's the revolutionary moment, and people know it. Hutcheson knew it, Kames knew it. In fact, Kames got into terrible twists trying to cope with it, if my reading of Kames is right. And I think I disagree with you about Hume's irreligion. This was notorious, or famous, I mean, depending on the way you wish to put it. More problematic was Smith. And whereas Hume actually can very seldom resist the temptation to tease priests, to tease religious belief necessarily. Smith won't. Under no circumstances will Smith do this. There are interesting questions about what one makes of Smith's silence on infidelity, although most of the people who knew him had very little doubt about where his actual religious principles lay. Intellectually, we can show that they are essentially Humean, the rocks on which Smith's philosophy is founded. So what I'm saying is, yes, that of course there was interesting philosophy, particularly in Hutcheson's case. Hutcheson is of absolutely towering importance in reshaping academic philosophy in the middle decades of the 18th century. But in fact, we move onto a different planet the moment that agenda is taken on by Hume and by Smith. Smith is, in fact, I think, to be seen as someone who turns his back on and rejects, in the last resort, the Hutchesonian legacy.
Hi, thank you very much for your beautiful talk. I am very impressed by the consequence of Hume's skepticism that you pointed out. One more consequence of which I was not aware before, and I do think many people like me were not. And also by your intriguing suggestion that in present-day Edinburgh, the performing arts take the place of what was the role of Hume's philosophy in the 18th century. My questions have to be with something that you said during your talk and that I don't know how to answer. I'm perfectly reconciled with the idea of accident in history. And I think it's Hume's history is proof of it. But I also think of Hume's essay of the rise and progress of the arts and sciences, where he tries to find some causes, at least some causes that can be traced, even though we cannot explain it all by them. And I'd like to know your take on that. And also, when you try to answer, what would keep Hume here today? I think what kept Hume in Edinburgh in his day were his friendships. What brought him back here at the end? What do you think of that? Please.
Well, I mean, part of the answer, I think, is a simple one. Hume was a very great historian, as well as being a great philosopher. And he made an awful lot of money out of writing history. And he, as I say, he died a rich man, a genuinely rich man. So the point was that apart from friendship, he had the resources to live very comfortably in Edinburgh. Other people didn't and moved. And it does have to be said that he got irritated with Edinburgh periodically. He had trouble with the church. Naturally, it would have been unintelligible if he hadn't had trouble with the church. But he also thought that he'd never been given. Hume was very interested in his reputation. And he thought that he'd never really been given his due in Britain or in Scotland. He liked France because he was lionized. He was an absolute smash hit in the salons in France. He was lionized as a very great man of letters indeed, and he loved it. And in fact, there's a very nice letter from Adam Smith when he says to Adam, well, why don't we just pack it in? We don't have to live in Scotland. Why don't we just go, you and I, just settle in Paris? And Smith gives him a real ticking off on lines which you would find sympathetic, because he said, well, actually, you know, these people are lionizing you today, they'll forget you tomorrow, and where are your true friends? They are, in fact, back in Scotland, and I'm going home, which indeed he did. So, I mean, it's quite right to mention friendship does matter, but it's just, in fact, the way in which the world of letters works, the way in which the world of universities work in the 18th century, which is completely different from the way in which they work now. Nowadays, academic talent and literary talent is global. It is infinitely mobile. If you have the resources, you can settle anywhere you like. And there are, and if you are in the Nobel League, and this is what we're talking about, if you like, Hume would have ended up in California, I'm absolutely sure. Caltech.
Following on from that last point, could we have an account of why it was Hume never got a chair at Edinburgh University?
Oh, well, it would be outrageous if Hume had been given a chair in Edinburgh University. He would have had to have taught moral philosophy. Moral philosophy is it's the queen of the sciences. It's the discipline, it's the culmination of the philosophy curriculum, which technically, theoretically, everyone does before going on to study for the professions, for divinity, for medicine, for law, and so forth. and if you're not going to do those, off you go into public life. It should be the crowning experience of the academic career of an up-and-coming generation of people destined for public life in a Christian polity. Now, that's not necessarily, say, a dogmatic Christian polity at all, but a believing Christian polity. And you do have to remember that in the 18th century, by law, entry to many of the professions depends, it will be conditioned partly by your religious affiliations. And the notion of putting a non-believer into that chair would have been completely, I mean, the town council would have fallen. I mean, it would have been a revolutionary thing to have done. And I think in a sort of way, it doesn't altogether matter. Because if you look at the way in which Hume reformats his very difficult thinking in the Treatise of Human Nature and develops and extends it in his essays and inquiries, what you will find is that he's in fact developing all the essential divisions of moral philosophy as it was known. But what he's doing is he's writing them up in books, in his inquiry concerning the principles of human understanding, the principles of morals, the political discourses. He's touching on everything except things like jurisprudence, which he could have been expected to lecture on in university classes. And he's doing it actually in a very interesting way because he's writing for an adult readership. Whereas Adam Smith in Glasgow is actually having to lecture to a teenage student population. And we have, although we have copies of student notes of Smith on jurisprudence and on rhetoric and belles lettres and so forth, you can't read these without being aware that they're there for a student consumption, and one wishes that in fact Smith had been able to carry out his plan to turn them into books for adult consumption. So, as I say, in a sort of way, as far as the university is concerned, I mean, I would have been horrified if Hume had been given a chair. I'm glad he wasn't, because it means we have texts that we wouldn't otherwise have had. And I also think that if he'd actually had a university chair, he would have wasted time, which he spent better as an absolutely superb writer, working on a very great history of England.
Thank you. I'm hoping we can share the platform for the last half a minute or so. I think what you'll agree is that tonight we've had a really particularly outstanding example of the Edinburgh Lectures. We've had speculation about Hume at Caltech. We've had ideas, which is a great reassurance to me personally, about a justification for why Hume didn't get that chair at the University of Edinburgh. And my personal favourite that I'll take away was the last part of your talk about the performing arts. Next time I'm fighting my way down the Royal Mile at festival time, trying to get to Waverley Station, I will say to myself, yes, I know what's going on here. We're having an enlightenment. Can you join with me, please, in thanking tonight's lecturer?
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.